Hello and welcome to day 20 of our reading plan. We will be looking at Genesis 49 to 50 today, Psalm 8 and Luke 20. In the Genesis section, we're coming to the end of Jacob's life, and Jacob is going to be sharing some words of blessing, some words of honor to his sons before he dies. This is not necessarily an easy thing to do, to read through. We don't really have this tradition in our world today of passing on blessings just before a parent's death. But Jacob is doing this. Reuben, the firstborn, loses his birthright because he made some bad choices. Simeon and Levi have also made some bad choices. Their consequences is they will no longer get any land in the promised land when the Israelites return after their time in Egypt. They were the revenge fighters that avenged their sister's honor, Dinah, when she was assaulted by the people of Shechem, but they did not respond in such a way that God appreciated, and so they are losing their right to land in the promised land. Judah is raised up, and the tribe of Judah is where King David and Jesus eventually comes from. The other sons get their blessings, their prayers from Jacob, and then Jacob passes away, and this is the end of the Jacob saga. After Jacob's burial, the brothers still don't trust Joseph. Now, Joseph has fed them all, given them refuge in Egypt, but the brothers are still dysfunctional as a family. They are still not getting along. And the question I have as I read through that is, what anxiety and distrust are we holding on to? What is it that no matter what happens in our lives, we still have a hard time trusting a certain person, a certain group of people? In Psalm 8, there's the question to God, why do you bother with us? Which is a good question. It seems like we can't get anything right and life is pretty miserable here on earth. And so there is this question, but the rest of Psalm 8 is really about pure praise. It is really lifting up the glory of God, and it's not asking for stuff. There's a lot of Psalms that are lamentations or that are intercessions. They are requests for help or for particular intervention on God's part. This one just honors God and worships and glorifies God. In Luke 20, the first few chapters, we've got the Pharisees again, the religious authorities. They're trying to trap Jesus, and in the end, they choose not to respond to what Jesus says to them, and Jesus then does not respond to them either. It's kind of a standoff situation. It shows some sneakiness on Jesus' part. He realizes he's not always going to win these debates, and going straight forward and directly arguing with people isn't going to get him anything in the end either. And so I think sometimes we also have to step back and say, you know what? There's a time to engage, and there's also a time to walk away. We have this interesting story about a vineyard. A master leaves some of his servants in charge as stewards of the vineyard while the master is away. The master sends some people back to see how things are going. They often get beat up by the stewards, sometimes even killed. And I think one of the questions that comes from this strange story is, are we acting like we own this place and that we can do anything? That's really what the stewards end up doing. We're in charge. We can do anything we want. The master's gone. It doesn't matter. There's an old idiom or saying that says, when the cat's away, the mice will play. Here, clearly, the mice are playing all over the place. The thing is, the story points out that there is going to be accountability. The cat is going to come back. The master is going to return and is going to want to see how things have been cared for. Right now, when we're discussing the impacts of climate change, I think a very serious question for us is, are we caring for the planet for the next 7 generations to thrive and prosper? Or do we just want to make our own lives comfortable? We don't want to go through the bother of changing things right now, regardless of what impact it might have on our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And I think that's a very challenging thing to think about. Now we have this story about what goes to the government. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. They hand him a coin, and Jesus is like, Caesar's on this coin, so give this coin to Rome. Use this money to pay your taxes to Rome. But I think the other part of this is, what are we choosing to give to God? It's not just what goes to the government and what goes to God. I think a lot of us forget to seriously consider, what are we giving to God? What are we choosing to return to God that God has given to us? Verse 34 talks about marriage. Who's going to be married to who in the afterlife when we get to heaven? And I think it's really interesting that Jesus' response here is that you guys are really preoccupied with marriage, and marriage is not the point in heaven. Things are going to be different in heaven. The focus is going to be on being with God. A lot of the stuff that has been important here on earth and that we focused on is just not going to be important when we get to heaven. Given how many churches, how many religious traditions have really focused on people's intimate lives, their intimate relationships, their family structures, I think that's really interesting to look at this and say, this might not be the most important thing that God is focused on. Jesus seems to be a lot more focused on caring for people who are ill, caring for people who are poor, caring for people who have been marginalized. Jesus doesn't really focus on our intimate relationships and our marriage status and our family structures. And I think sometimes we are really focused on the things that are not as important, and that we should really spend more time looking beyond ourselves and our own personal preferences and really think about what was it that was a priority for God and Jesus throughout the Bible. The final section here is beware of religious leaders who walk around getting noticed and taking seats of honor. Jesus is really making a statement against the pastors who have long prayers or who are trying to convince or trick people to give them more than they can afford. I think this is something that has really damaged the church in our world today. There's been a lot of religious leaders who've frankly been corrupt, who've been abusive in relationships, who have been about building up their own wealth, but there has been a lack of honesty and integrity and modesty among the leaders, both religious and civic leaders of our time. And I think Jesus is really saying, you know what? The first shall be last, the last shall be first, means that you don't go around lifting yourself up. You go around, you live a modest life, you live a humble life, you live a life of honesty, integrity, and that is what matters, both, especially for religious leaders, but for all people in all places at all times. And I think as we look at the leaders in our world today, whether it's business leaders, political leaders, any type of leaders, I think we could use a whole lot more modesty and humility and integrity. Have a super day. We'll see you next time.